In this follow-up episode, we look at the costumes of the HBO series Gentleman Jack. Coming up. Welcome back to Costume Co. I do almost weekly videos analyzing television shows and movies from a costume perspective. If you want to keep up to date on my latest videos, consider subscribing so you don't miss out. This is the second part of what is now a 3-part series on the costumes of the BBC HBO series Gentleman Jack. In this episode, we take a closer look at the costumes of Anne Lister, portrayed in the series by Suranne Jones. In case you missed part 1, I'll leave a link for you in the description below. Warning, there are spoilers for all 8 episodes of season 1. Suranne Jones says in a BBC behind-the-scenes video that Anne Lister was born in 1791 in Yorkshire, Halifax. She was a diarist, a lesbian, a traveler, an entrepreneur, a self-educator, and an all-around brilliant woman. Tom Pye, costume designer for this series, tells me in an interview that Anne Lister's sexuality and her unusual style of dress was an interesting challenge. I felt this was a key design brief for the show, to make her character believable while also expressing just how unusual she was for her time. I feel I've done my job if the audience fully understands why locals nicknamed her Gentleman Jack or mistook her for a man, Tom says. If we could land this, then the world of the show would make sense and be coherent. Tom also says that Suranne is a very beautiful and elegant feminine woman, so we needed to work quite hard to make the qualities of Anne Lister believable. He adds that there's a suggestion within her diaries that she was clearly conforming to some degree and wearing female clothing, but a number of these terms suggest styles more popular in the 1820s rather than the 1830s. I concluded that context was going to be essential to understand Anne in comparison to other women. Suranne Jones says the hair and the collar is from a very famous portrait. We didn't try to beautify me in any way. Eventually, we came to this place where we liked the look, which was kind of top half male, bottom half female, so she's still wearing skirts. And then we added a top hat so that she stuck out in a crowd, and then we gave her a cane, which is obviously for the day very masculine. Tom says that I also had to support Suranne in forming a character that would leap off the page, so she probably is a slightly theatricalized version of the true Anne. I doubt Anne Lister really wore a top hat, and her tailors may not have been quite so sharp. Like many of the headwear worn in the show, Anne's top hat was made by milliner Sean Barrett. Here's an example of a white beaver man's top hat with grosgrain ribbon trim that's from the V&A, and it's made between 1830 to 1840 and labeled Made in London. This hat is 7.5 inches tall or 19 centimeters. The V&A states that most top hats were initially made from beaver felt, and so this example from the 1930s is fairly typical of its time. And because of the top hat, hair and makeup designer Lynn Davy had to create a 19th century hairstyle for Anne that would look good with or without the hat. Suranne says that they added some braids for height and gave her side rolls, which they called croquettes, named after the cylindrical shaped food. These 3 sketches seen here are taken from Tom's Instagram account, and they're the first designs he did of Anne Lister before the show was cast with Suranne Jones and over a year before filming. These were the first costume renderings that Tom showed Suranne back when the show was still called Shibden Hall, before it was eventually named Gentleman Jack. In the opening sequence, we see Anne getting dressed in her underpinnings, which include this set of stays or corset. Suranne Jones says, Anne Lister does a lot of things in a corset that women of the day wouldn't normally do in corsets. She climbs walls, rides carriages, she walks very fast. Tom tells me that Saran suffered most from her corset. We had to alter that to make it more flexible to allow for all the physicality of the role. We used a method I learned from Parkinson Gill, theatrical costumers, who make my costumes for ballet, whereby we remove panels in her corset and swap them for a kind of fabric called power net, which totally solved the problem whilst keeping a good corseted shape. In this screen grab, you can see Anne inserting a wooden busk into the center front pocket of the corset. Here's a picture of the carved wooden busk from Tom's Instagram account. The busk was made by Nadia O, with decorations that include Anne Lister's initials, the Yorkshire Rose, Shibden Hall, and a Latin phrase at the top that translates roughly as just and firm of purpose. This 1830s English bound corset from the V&A in London is a very close likeness to Anne's. It's made of buff canvas. The men's drawers or underwear are worn over top of the corset and buttoned up at the front. This example of a pair of French linen drawers, hand-sewn with linen thread, are made between 1775 and 1800. The V&A states that the waistband buttons in front and usually features eyelet holes at the back. These were tied with linen tape, allowing a degree of give in an age before the use of elastic clothing. This is Tom's design of Anne's multi-tiered linen greatcoat, along with some of his reference images. Anne Lister, of course, makes her show debut in this costume upon her return to Yorkshire. The double-breasted coat was made by tailor Dan Ashworth at Cosprop, London. According to Dan's Instagram account, where this picture is posted, this is what the coat looked like before it was waxed and broken down by Nicolina Griffiths. In this image of the back of the coat, it's all of the fine hand-sewing details that really lend to the historical authenticity of this costume. This close-up image is also from Dan's Instagram page. Here's an illustrated example of a French gentleman's greatcoat, sometimes called a carrack or garrick, a type of traveling riding coat from an 1811 fashion plate. And while the coat is typically a man's garment, women did adopt this silhouette for themselves. You can see that there isn't too much difference between the man's greatcoat and this woman's wool pelisse from the Snow Hill Wade costume collection. With its multiple cape layers, the collar is faced in silk velvet, and the coat dates between 1820 to 1830. Regarding Anne's perpetual mourning dress and her reason behind it, Tom says, "I wasn't fully believing her reasoning for the black as mourning. She did say that in the diary, but I'm sure it was also about wanting to adopt a more masculine color palette too." In the few portraits of Anne that do exist, she is clearly depicted wearing a brown pelisse and a red heart pin, Tom says. So I use this as a license to not take the black-only rule that seriously. If brown was okay, I assume she must have worn a rather monochrome palette, but maybe not strictly all black. So I crept in grays, silvers, dark blues, and browns. I felt that was the most important thing, was that she looked nothing like the other female characters. The heart-shaped pin was made to replicate the one seen in her portrait. It was created by Stephen's Jewelers in Cheshire. Here's one of the many waistcoats or vests that Anne wears. Waistcoats are typically a man's garment, but all of her waistcoats are modified to fit her form with the corset underneath. Anne always keeps her silver pocket watch in her waistcoat pocket. Here's a close-up of it from the opening. This silk satin brocade single-breasted waistcoat features a shawl collar. It's dated between 1830 to 1840, and it's from the Snow Hill Wade costume collection. Anne also wears men's shirts. This British linen shirt dated between 1830 to 40 is from the Costume Institute at the Met. The sleeves are one piece and gathered into the drop shoulder, but a gusset has been added under the arm to allow for additional movement. Tom says that Anne Lister's footwear was as practical as could be. She only ever wore strong leather boots in either black or brown, and usually she wore gaiters over these. You can see the black ones in the credit sequence, and she also has an even more sturdy pair made from hard brown leather. The gaiters exaggerated the size of her feet, but they also reflect her interest in being practical and being able to be free. Anne is using a button hook to close the buttons on her gaiters. Here's an example of linen gaiters, or spatterdashes or spats for short, from a slightly earlier period dating 1800 to 1825 from the Snows Hill Wade costume collection. Here's Tom's illustration of Anne's black spencer and skirt with some of his costume reference pictures. The Spencer jacket pictured on the left was made in the 1830s. According to the V&A, where this costume is held, this type of short jacket, which ends at the waist, is known as a spencer. The spencer was initially a man's garment. It is said to have originated in the late 1790s, taking its name from George, the second Earl of Spencer. It was one of the few women's garments that were tailored during this period. This particular Spencer jacket is from Tom Pye's influence board, dated 1815 from the Kyoto Costume Institute in Japan. Anne's Spencer jacket sits just above the natural waistline, which was the fashion of the time, and it features a stand-up collar and shoulder epaulettes and a box-pleated tail. The tail detail is a carryover from the second half of the 18th century in a popular women's short-fitted jacket called a pierrot, which is French for sparrow. According to Tom's Instagram, both the Spencer and skirt were made by Cosprop London. The standout feature are the rows of braids and buttons, inspired by this 1910 military-style redingote, also from the Kyoto Costume Institute. According to the museum, the Brandenburg style, as it was called, gained inspiration from the French hussar, worn by Napoleon's light cavalrymen. Women's clothing was strongly influenced by the functional and practical style of men's and military wear. Here's Tom's costume design of Anne's business suit, which was made by Dan Ashworth at Cosprop London. Here are some pictures of the coat taken from Dan's Instagram account. You can see how much labor goes into creating an historical coat with this example of the hand sewing on the back of the collar by Dan. This double-breasted linen jacket was made by Elizabeth Inkle with the fabric supplied by Whaley's Bradford Limited in the UK. Because Anne Lister walked everywhere, and so that Saran was able to have a full range of movement in her costumes, a lot of this had to be worked out long before they got to set. Tom tells me that, right from the very first fitting I did with Saran in November 2017, every session included using the corridor outside the room. I was always keen to see how the costumes moved. That stride was very much born first in the costume house corridor. I think it was really useful for us to both try out everything she wore in movement. It's such a big part of who Anne was and really informed her character. Tom also says that her whole costume took quite a battering. There was constant maintenance needed for all of her clothes as well as her boots. Funnily enough, that echoed much of what I read in Anne Lister's diary. There are so many entries of her sister Marion mending things for her. It seems to be a daily event, and it was for us too. Here's Tom's design of Anne's black police dress made by Cosprop of London. With its silky texture and velvet trimmings and buttons, this is a more feminine silhouette for Anne, although she does incorporate her cravat and pocket watch into the ensemble. She wears this look to Vera Hobart's wedding in episode 2, and then to court to meet Queen Anne of Denmark in episode 8. To give you some perspective, this English silk pelisse dates about 1820. According to the V&A, this is an example of a pelisse robe or a dress in the style of a coat. It was often worn for walking or visiting during the day. Unlike most other dresses of the period, the pelisse robe opens down the front and has a wide collar. Here's a view from the back of the pelisse. Notice the angled shoulder seams and full gathers at the center back, typical of the silhouette seen in the Regency era. Of course, the standout feature is this tall military-style hat made by Sean Barrett. Tom took inspiration for the hat from this French 1814 portrait of Caroline Murat, Queen of Naples. Anne's costumes also show her journey. not just because where she is on her travels, but how she's feeling at the time. Tom explains that in episodes 7 and 8, I wanted to show a sense of optimism about her forthcoming travels, that she was excited to get away, but I also wanted to express to the audience that time was passing and that Anne's wardrobe was evolving accordingly. For her return journey, Tom says, I wanted to express the opposite feeling as she was depressed, upset, and concerned for her aunt. In this period, women had carriage dresses that were clothes designed just for the purpose of traveling. And so I tried to reflect this by dressing Anne in clothes we hadn't seen her in before. I wanted her to head off with great optimism and to return rather bedraggled and downcast. Her diary entries from this time describe how she slept for days in her greatcoat, so I kept her in the same costume all the way home and had it heavily broken down. Tom adds that we had 2 versions of the same fur hat made, so we could really mess the second one up and make the feathers look dreadfully forlorn. Anne's Cesar jacket with fur trim and skirt was made by Lookout Point Limited. Here's Tom's costume design for Anne's ball gown made by David Plunkett. The silhouette for the gown is similar to this fashion plate from the Met, which was published in 1834 in St. Petersburg. Pictured on the right is a white ball gown with colored floral embroidery on the skirt and beret sleeves. The beret sleeve pictured on the left, which is generally worn for evening, is made out of a large circle of fabric. This circa 1830 English woman's dress is from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and it's made from silk plain weave organza and silk satin. And the sash is similar to Anne's gown, a reference to the military uniform of the Hussars. The feather in Anne's incredible updo were supplied by Sean Barrett. In episode 8, we finally arrive at Anne's wedding outfit. In a true departure from the black and brown and gray palette, Anne dons this beautiful blue tailcoat with this lively blue jacquard waistcoat. This style of collar pictured here is called an M-notch because of its resemblance to the letter M. Here's a close-up of the beautiful cobalt blue and ivory fabric of the waistcoat. Anne's jacket was tailored by Dan Ashworth, and the waistcoat was created by Dan's colleague Anna. I'll have the final installment of the Gentleman Jack costumes coming soon, and it will feature the costumes of Anne Walker and other ladies' costumes. Thank you so much to Tom Pye for being generous and sharing your process and your resources. You can read my full interview with Tom on my Facebook page. I'll leave a link for that below. I'll see you in the next video.